Every person knows the ache of being told they're not enough for love. Some carry that wound their whole lives, believing the cruel whispers that follow them wherever they go. In the town of Dry Hollow, giant cowboy Amos Fletcher stood 7 feet tall, but felt invisible to every woman who crossed his path. The blacksmith's daughter, Cordelia, knew that same loneliness. Folks saw her sighs before they saw her heart. Then one evening, something beautiful happened. Cordelia walked up to Amos and kissed him, right there on Main Street for everyone to see. That single kiss changed everything. 2 people who'd been told they weren't worthy of love found it in each other. But what happens when the whole town turns against their unexpected romance? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Dry Hollow, painting the dusty streets in shades of gold and amber. This was a town where everyone knew their place, where reputations were carved in stone and expectations ran deeper than the wells that sustained life in this unforgiving country. The smell of wood smoke and leather hung in the air, mingling with the distant sound of hammers against anvils and the gentle lowing of cattle being driven to pasture. Amos Fletcher had learned long ago that size didn't guarantee belonging. 7 feet and 2 inches tall, with shoulders broad enough to fill a doorway, and hands that could span a horse's neck, he moved through Dry Hollow like a mountain among hills. His boots, size 15 and custom-made by the only cobbler brave enough to take on such a task, left deep impressions in the dusty streets. Children pointed and whispered when he passed, their mothers pulling them closer with nervous glances. Men nodded with respectful wariness, the kind reserved for forces of nature you couldn't quite control. But for all his imposing presence, Amos carried himself with the careful gentleness of someone who had learned early that his strength could frighten as easily as protect. His voice, when he spoke at all, was surprisingly soft for such a large man, like distant thunder on a clear day. He had his father's deep-set grey eyes and his mother's patient way of listening, though few people stayed long enough in conversation to notice such details. The Silver Dollar Ranch, where Amos had worked for the better part of 15 years, stretched across thousands of acres of rough grassland and rocky hills. Owner Clayton Morrison was a hard man who measured worth in cattle branded and miles ridden, but he'd never found fault with Amos's work. The giant cowboy could gentle the most stubborn horse, track lost cattle across terrain that would challenge a bloodhound, and work from sun-up to sundown without complaint. What Morrison couldn't understand, what none of them could understand, was why such a capable man seemed content to live alone in a small cabin on the far edge of the property, sharing his evenings with nothing but the wind and his thoughts. The sea. Truth was that Amos had tried, in his younger years, to court the daughters of Dry Hollow. He'd cleaned up his best shirt and combed his hair with water and hope, only to watch their faces change when he approached. Some laughed behind their hands. Others simply looked away, as if acknowledging his presence might somehow diminish them. The kinder ones offered polite conversation before excusing themselves to dance with smaller, more acceptable partners. Each rejection had carved away another piece of his confidence until he'd learned to expect nothing and hope for less. In his small cabin, Amos kept his father's tarnished silver spurs hanging on a nail above the fireplace. Thomas Fletcher had been a man of average height but outsized reputation, known throughout 3 counties for his skill with horses and his way with words. The spurs were all Amos had left of him, inherited along with stories of a father who'd died too young and expectations that felt impossible to meet. Thomas Fletcher had been charming where his son was awkward, quick with a joke where Amos struggled for words. The spurs served as a daily reminder of the gap between who Amos was and who he felt he should have been. Across town, where the main street widened into the heart of Dry Hollow's modest commercial district, the blacksmith shop stood like a cathedral of honest work. The building itself was sturdy and functional, built from local stone, with a roof blackened by years of smoke from the forge. Inside, the air shimmered with heat waves and rang with the rhythmic percussion of hammer against metal. This was Cordelia's domain, inherited from her father Jeremiah, but shaped by her own vision and determination. At 26, Cordelia moved through the shop with the confidence of someone who had found their calling early and pursued it without apology. Her hands, scarred and calloused from years of working with fire and metal, could coax beauty from the roughest iron. She wore her dark hair pulled back in a practical braid, and her leather apron bore the honest stains of her trade. When she worked, bent over the forge with sweat beading on her forehead, there was something almost sacred in her concentration. The people of Dry Hollow respected Cordelia's skill, even as they whispered about her appearance. She had inherited her mother's round face and generous curves, traits that had been celebrated in Margaret O'Sullivan before consumption claimed her when Cordelia was barely 12. But where Margaret had been petite and delicate, Cordelia was substantial, built for endurance rather than decoration. The town's matrons spoke of her in hushed tones, expressing sympathy for poor Jeremiah, saddled with a daughter who would never find a husband. What they failed to see, what most people failed to see, was the gentle kindness that informed everything Cordelia did. She mended tools with the same care she might use to heal a wounded animal, understanding that every piece of metal had a purpose and deserved to fulfill it properly. When Mrs. Henderson's plough blade cracked just before planting season, Cordelia worked through the night to repair it, refusing payment beyond a jar of preserves and a grateful handshake. When young Timothy Bradshaw brought her a broken bit from his father's bridle, she not only fixed it, but spent an hour teaching him how to care for leather properly. Jeremiah O'Sullivan watched his daughter with a mixture of pride and worry that kept him awake more nights than he cared to admit. At 58, he had the weathered look of a man who had spent his life wrestling with fire and metal. But his eyes held the gentleness that came from raising a daughter alone. He had taught Cordelia everything he knew about the trade, recognizing early that she had a natural gift that exceeded his own. But he also saw how the town treated her, how the other young women excluded her from their social gatherings, how the young men looked right through her as if she were invisible. The blacksmith shop served as the unofficial gathering place for men who needed tools mended and wanted to share the day's gossip. It was here that Amos Fletcher first began appearing regularly, not just for the occasional repair work that ranch life demanded, but for the quiet conversations that grew longer. Each visit, Jeremiah noticed how his daughter's demeanor changed when the giant cowboy approached, how her voice softened and her smile came easier. At first, he'd been protective in the way that fathers are when they see their daughters showing interest in any man. But as weeks turned to months, Jeremiah began to observe the way Amos treated Cordelia with a respect and attention that few people in Dry Hollow had ever shown her. The big man listened when she spoke, asked thoughtful questions about her work, and never seemed to notice or care about the physical traits that others found so troubling. The other ranch hands at the Silver Dollar knew Amos as a reliable worker and a man of few words, but they'd begun to notice his frequent trips to town for supplies that could have waited, repairs that seemed suspiciously urgent. Buck Williams, a wiry cowboy with more opinions than sense, had started making jokes about Amos's town business, though he was careful to make them when the big man was out of earshot. Even Buck wasn't stupid enough to directly confront someone who could lift him off his feet with one hand. Mayor Harrison Blackwell represented the town's established order with the self-importance of a man who had inherited his position along with his father's general store. At 45, he had the soft features of someone who had never missed a meal or worked with his hands, and he viewed any disruption to Dry Hollow's social hierarchy as a personal affront. He'd built his reputation on maintaining standards, which in practice meant keeping everyone in their proper place according to his rigid understanding of how things should be. The mayor's wife, Constance, held court among the town's ladies with the authority of someone who had appointed herself the arbiter of proper behavior. She organized the church socials, decided which families were suitable for inclusion in their circle, and maintained a careful catalogue of who belonged where in Dry Hollow's pecking order. In her view, the blacksmith's daughter was a useful member of the community in her proper role, but any attempt to rise above that station would be met with swift correction. Reverend Samuel Crenshaw preached from the pulpit of the white-painted church every Sunday morning, delivering sermons about Christian charity while carefully avoiding any mention of looking beyond surface appearances. He was a thin man with prematurely grey hair and the nervous habit of adjusting his spectacles when uncomfortable, which happened frequently when forced to confront the gap between his words and his actions. As autumn deepened into winter, the rhythm of life in Dry Hollow continued its predictable pattern. Cattle were driven to lower pastures, crops were harvested and stored, and families prepared for the long months when the outside world seemed very far away. But beneath this familiar routine, something was stirring, an awareness that change was coming, whether the town was ready for it or not. Amos had begun visiting the blacksmith shop with increasing frequency, always finding legitimate reasons for his presence, but staying longer each time. He'd started bringing small gifts, a particularly interesting rock he'd found while riding fence, wildflowers that grew only in high mountain meadows, once a pair of perfectly matched horseshoes he'd discovered at an abandoned homestead. These offerings were presented with the shy formality of someone who was out of practice with courtship but determined to learn. Cordelia found herself looking forward to these visits with an anticipation that both thrilled and terrified her. She'd grown so accustomed to being overlooked that having someone's focused attention felt like standing too close to her own forge, wonderful and overwhelming at the same time. When Amos spoke to her about her work, asking about techniques and materials with genuine curiosity, she felt valued in a way that had nothing to do with pity or charity. The town, of course, had begun to notice. Dry Hollow was too small, and its citizens too starved for entertainment for such visits to go unobserved. Mrs. Patterson made a point of walking past the blacksmith shop whenever she saw Amos's horse tied outside, always finding some errand that required her immediate attention in that direction. Young couples walking out together would slow their pace when passing the shop, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was developing between the unlikely pair. But it was the evening conversations that truly mattered. Those moments when the formal excuses fell away and two lonely people discovered they had more in common than either had dared hope. Amos would linger as Jeremiah banked the forge fires for the night, helping with small tasks while talking quietly with Cordelia about everything and nothing, the weather, the changing seasons, shared memories of parents who had died too soon. These conversations revealed depths that neither had expected. Amos spoke of books he'd read during long winter evenings, revealing an education that surprised even Jeremiah. He'd taught himself from volumes left behind by a circuit preacher, developing a vocabulary, an understanding that his daily work never required him to display. Cordelia shared her dreams of expanding the blacksmith shop, of creating not just functional tools, but decorative pieces that would bring beauty into the harsh landscape of frontier life. As the first snow began to dust the mountains surrounding Dry Hollow, both Amos Fletcher and Cordelia O'Sullivan found themselves standing at the threshold of something that felt both inevitable and impossible. They were two people who had learned to expect very little from life, discovering that sometimes the most unexpected gifts come when you've stopped looking for them. The stage was set, the players in their positions, and the town of Dry Hollow was about to learn that love, like metal in the forge, could be transformed by sufficient heat and pressure into something entirely new and surprisingly strong. The evening air carried the bite of approaching winter as Amos guided his horse down Main Street, the familiar weight of supplies from Morrison's weekly town run secured behind his saddle. The sun hung low on the horizon, painting the weathered buildings in shades of gold and crimson that made even Dry Hollow's dusty streets look almost beautiful. Most of the shops had closed for the day, their windows dark except for the warm glow spilling from the blacksmith shop at the far end of the street. He'd told himself he was only stopping to check on a bridle repair, nothing more than the practical business that had brought him to town in the first place. But as his horse's hooves clicked against the packed earth, Amos found his heart beating with an anticipation that had nothing to do with leather work and everything to do with the woman who would be waiting inside that stone building. The sound of hammer on metal greeted him as he dismounted, a rhythm as familiar as his own heartbeat, but somehow more musical when Cordelia was the one creating it. Through the open doorway, he could see her bent over the forge, her face illuminated by the dancing flames as she shaped a piece of iron with practiced precision. She wore her mother's locket at her throat, a delicate piece of silver that seemed almost fragile against the practical strength of everything else about her. "Evening, Cordelia," he called softly, not wanting to startle her during such delicate work. She looked up with a smile that transformed her entire face, setting down her hammer with careful attention to safety before turning to greet him. "Amos Fletcher, you're becoming as regular as the mail coach. Not that I'm complaining, mind you. Jeremiah around?" he asked, though he could see the older man's coat hanging on its usual peg and hear no sounds from the back room where he usually worked on smaller repairs. "Gone to the Patterson place to look at their plow. Won't be back till late." She wiped her hands on her leather apron, leaving smudges that somehow made her look more beautiful rather than less. "But your bridle's ready, if that's what brought you by." It wasn't, and they both knew it. Over the past months, their conversations had grown longer and more personal, filled with the comfortable silences that came when two people discovered they understood each other in ways that didn't require explanation. Tonight felt different, though charged with an electricity that had nothing to do with the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. "Actually," Amos said, removing his hat and running nervous fingers through his dark hair, "I was hoping we might talk about things that aren't bridles or horseshoes or the weather." Cordelia's hands stilled on the apron ties she'd been adjusting. "What kind of things?" "The kind that make a man ride to town more often than good sense would dictate. The kind that keep him awake nights thinking about a woman who's too good for him, but who might, if he's very lucky, be willing to give him a chance anyway." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from the forge, visible and substantial and impossible to take back. Amos felt his face flush with heat that had nothing to do with the fire behind Cordelia, certain he'd overstepped and ruined whatever fragile friendship they'd built. But instead of the gentle rejection he expected, Cordelia stepped closer, her brown eyes searching his face with an intensity that made him forget to breathe. "Amos Fletcher," she said quietly, "are you trying to court me?" "I'm trying to work up the courage to ask if you'd let me." She laughed then, a sound like silver bells that made something tight in his chest finally relax. "You dear foolish man, did you think I kept finding reasons to work late every time you came to town by accident?" The admission hit him like a physical blow, not painful, but stunning in its implications. She'd been hoping for his visits, looking forward to them, finding excuses to spend time with him, just as he'd been doing with her. The knowledge was so unexpected, so contrary to everything he'd learned to expect from women, that for a moment he couldn't find words at all. "Cordelia," he began, then stopped, overwhelmed by everything he wanted to say, and his complete lack of experience in saying it. "Come here," she said softly, extending her hand toward him. He crossed the space between them in 3 long strides, his own hand engulfing hers with a gentleness that belied his size. Standing this close, he could see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes, smell the faint scent of roses that clung to her hair, despite the smoke and metal of her work environment. She was beautiful, not in the conventional way that the town measured beauty, but in the way that mattered to him, with intelligence and kindness, and a strength that matched his own. "I need you to know something," Cordelia said, her voice steady despite the way her hand trembled slightly in his. "I've heard what people say about me, about us, about how we don't fit what they think we should be. I don't care what they say, neither. Or do I? Not anymore." She took a deep breath, as if steeling herself for something that required great courage. "Amos Fletcher, I've spent 26 years letting other people decide what I was worth, letting their opinions shape how I saw myself. But when I'm with you, I remember who I really am underneath all their judgments." "Who are you?" he asked, though he thought he already knew. "I'm a woman who deserves to be loved for who she is, not in spite of it. And I'm a woman who's falling. In love with a man who's too worried about what the whole world thinks to see what's right in front of him." The confession hung between them like a challenge and a gift, wrapped in the same moment. Amos felt something shift in his chest. A door, opening that he'd kept locked for so many years, he'd forgotten it was there. Looking down at Cordelia's upturned face, he saw not the woman the town pitied, but the woman who had captured his heart with her fierce independence and gentle kindness. "I love you too," he said, the words coming easier than he'd expected. "I think I have for months now. Then stop thinking so much and kiss me." Later, he would remember every detail of that moment. The way the evening light slanted through the doorway, casting long shadows across the floor. The distant sound of horses passing on the street outside. The warmth radiating from the forge behind them, but in the moment itself, there was nothing but Cordelia's face tilted up toward his, and the overwhelming rightness of finally, giving in to what he'd been feeling for so long. When their lips met, it was with the tentative gentleness of two people who had waited a long time for this moment and wanted to make it last. Cordelia's hand came up to rest against his chest, over his heart that was beating so hard he was certain she could feel it through his shirt. His other hand found the small of her back, pulling her closer with a care that spoke of reverence. Rather than passion, the kiss lasted only seconds, but it changed everything. When they broke apart, both breathing unsteadily, Amos saw his own wonder reflected in Cordelia's eyes. She was smiling, an expression so radiant it made the forge fire seem dim by comparison. "Well," she said breathlessly, "I suppose that settles that." "Settles what?" "Whether we're brave enough to choose love over reputation." It was then that Amos became aware of the voices outside, the shocked gasps and whispered exclamations that meant their moment of privacy had become anything but private. Through the open doorway, he could see the shapes of people gathered on the street, faces turned toward the blacksmith shop with expressions ranging from surprise to scandal to outright disapproval. Mrs. Patterson stood closest to the door, her mouth hanging open in shock. Behind her, Mayor Blackwell's face was flushed with indignation, while his wife clutched her shawl as if she'd witnessed something obscene. Young Timothy Bradshaw was grinning widely until his mother yanked him away by the ear, hissing something about inappropriate displays. The moment of perfect happiness shattered like glass, replaced by the cold reality of what they'd just done, and who had seen them do it. Amos felt Cordelia stiffen in his arms, though she didn't pull away. "Let them look," she said, her voice carrying clearly to the gathered crowd. "I'm not ashamed of loving a good man." The words were a declaration of war as much as love, a line drawn in the dust that would force the town to choose sides. As the implications of what had just happened began to sink in, Amos realized that their kiss hadn't just changed everything. Between them, it had changed everything, period. There would be no going back to the careful friendship they'd maintained, no pretending that what existed between them was anything less than what it was. The battle for their right to love each other had officially begun. The bronze church bell that had called Dry Hollow to worship and judgment for 30 years rang out across the town the next morning, its solemn tolling seeming to carry extra weight in the crisp autumn air. But today, it wasn't Sunday services. that had the town buzzing with activity. It was the scandalous scene witnessed at the blacksmith shop the evening before. Amos woke in his cabin on the Silver Dollar Ranch to find Buck Williams and two other hands waiting outside his door. There, expressions ranging from curious to amused to openly skeptical. Buck, never one to let an opportunity for gossip pass unused, was practically vibrating with excitement. "Well, well," Buck said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "Looks like our quiet giant's been keeping secrets." "It's not a secret if half the town was watching," replied Jim Hawley, the oldest of the ranch hands, though his tone held more sympathy than mockery. Amos pulled on his boots and hat, trying to maintain the composure that had served him well for 15 years of ranch work. But inside, his stomach churned with a mixture of joy from the night before and dread for what the day might bring. "If you men have something to say, say it plain. Just wondering if you lost your mind along with your heart," Buck continued, apparently immune to the warning in Amos's voice. "That blacksmith girl, really, I mean, she's nice enough, but what?" The words came out quieter than Amos intended, which somehow made them more menacing. Buck's confidence faltered slightly as he remembered exactly who he was talking to. "Just seems like you could do better is all. A man of your capabilities." "My capabilities?" Amos stepped closer, his considerable shadow falling across the smaller man. "What capabilities would those be, Buck?" Jim Hawley recognized the danger in Amos's tone and stepped forward diplomatically. "What Buck means is that you've got your pick of women. Seems odd to settle on one who might not be what most folks expect." "Most folks don't know Cordelia O'Sullivan," Amos replied, his voice carrying a finality that ended the conversation. "Now, if you're done discussing my personal business, we've got cattle to move." But the encounter set the tone for what would be a long, difficult day. As they worked, Amos caught snatches of whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when he approached. During the noon meal, the usual camaraderie around the campfire felt strained, with too many meaningful glances and too few direct words. The worst moment came when Clayton Morrison himself rode out to check on their progress. The ranch owner was a man of few words and practical concerns, more interested in productivity than gossip. But even he seemed compelled to address what the entire county was apparently discussing. "Fletcher," Morrison said, dismounting and walking over to where Amos was checking the shoes on his horse. "Heard you caused quite a stir in town yesterday." "Did I?" Amos kept his attention on the horse's hoof, though every muscle in his body tensed. "Look, what you do on your own time is your business. But this ranch has a reputation to maintain. I can't afford to have my men becoming the subject of town gossip, especially not the kind that makes good Christian families uncomfortable." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Amos straightened slowly, his grey eyes meeting Morrison's steady gaze. "Are you firing me?" Morrison hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the conversation. "I'm asking you to think carefully about your choices. You're a good worker, Fletcher, best I've ever had. But if this situation becomes a distraction, it won't affect my work. See that it doesn't." Morrison rode away without another word, leaving Amos to wonder how long his employment would last if the town's disapproval continued to grow. The Silver Dollar Ranch depended on good relationships with local businesses, and if those relationships suffered because of Amos's romantic choices, he knew Morrison wouldn't hesitate to cut him loose. Meanwhile, across town, Cordelia was facing her own challenges. The blacksmith shop, usually busy with the steady stream of customers needing tools repaired or horses shod, had been eerily quiet all morning. By noon, only old Pete Jameson had brought in work, a broken axe handle that he'd apologetically explained. "I couldn't wait for the traveling smith from Cedar Ridge. Don't know what's got into folks," Pete muttered, though they both knew exactly what had gotten into them. "Bunch of old biddies with nothing better to do than gossip, if you ask me." Cordelia appreciated his loyalty, but she could see the discomfort in his weathered face, the way he avoided meeting her eyes directly. Even Pete, who'd known her since she was a child, helping her father around the shop, was struggling with this new version of her. The woman who would kiss a man in public without shame or apology. The afternoon brought a visit from Mayor Blackwell and his wife, along with several other prominent townspeople. They arrived in a group, as if seeking safety in numbers, and arranged themselves in the shop with the formal precision of a tribunal. "Miss O'Sullivan," the mayor began, his voice carrying the pompous authority he reserved for official business, "we need to discuss your conduct yesterday evening." Cordelia set down her hammer deliberately, meeting each of their gazes in turn. "What about my conduct, Mayor Blackwell?" The public display of affection with that ranch hand, Constance Blackwell, interrupted, her voice sharp with disapproval. "It was unseemly, inappropriate. The children saw, Cordelia. The children saw two adults who care for each other sharing a kiss. I hardly think that will corrupt their moral fiber." "It's not just about the kiss," the mayor continued. "It's about setting an example, about maintaining standards. This town has a reputation for judging people by their size rather than their character," Cordelia replied, surprising herself with her boldness. Maybe it's time that changed. Mrs. Henderson, who had been silently wringing her hands, finally spoke up. "Dear, we're not trying to hurt you. We just think you should consider whether this attachment is in your best interests. That man, he's not like us. He's too big, too what? Too kind, too honest, too willing to treat me like a woman worth loving instead of a burden to be pitied." The uncomfortable silence that followed told Cordelia everything she needed to know about how the town really saw her. She was their pet charity case, the unfortunate daughter they could feel superior to while making small gestures of kindness. The idea that she might find love, real love, with a good man who saw her worth, threatened their comfortable assumptions about how the world should work. When Jeremiah returned from the Patterson place that evening, he found his daughter sitting in the growing darkness, staring into the banked coals of the forge. One look at her face told him everything he needed to know about how the day had gone. "They came to see you," he said, settling into his chair with a heavy sigh. "A whole delegation, very official. What did you tell them?" Cordelia was quiet for a long moment, absently fingering her mother's locket. "I told them the truth, that I love Amos Fletcher and I'm not ashamed of it." Jeremiah studied his daughter's face in the dim light, seeing not the hurt child she might have been, but the strong woman she had become. "And how do you feel about that truth this evening?" "Scared," she admitted, "but not sorry, never sorry." She looked up at him with eyes that held more determination than doubt. "Papa, I've spent my whole life letting other people decide what I was worth. I won't do it anymore." "Good," Jeremiah said quietly. "Your mother would be proud." As night settled over Dry Hollow, both Amos and Cordelia lay awake in their separate homes, acutely aware that their simple kiss had set forces in motion that would test everything they thought they knew about love, courage, and the price of choosing happiness over acceptance. The town's first attempt at pressure had been mild, almost polite in its disapproval. They both suspected that wouldn't last long. 3 days after the kiss that had set Dry Hollow buzzing, Amos found himself riding toward town with something wrapped carefully in his saddlebags, something that had taken him the better part of 2 evenings to complete. His hands, more accustomed to rope and leather than delicate work, had struggled with the intricate details, but the result was worth every frustrated moment. The object nestled in soft cloth was a rose, but not one that would ever wilt or fade. Crafted from iron with painstaking care, each petal had been hammered thin and shaped by hand, then heated and cooled until the metal took on the deep charcoal color of a forge at sunset. It wasn't pretty in any conventional sense. The petals were imperfect, the stem slightly crooked, but it represented something that no real flower could match. Permanence, strength, and beauty found in unexpected places. Cordelia was alone in the shop when he arrived, working on what appeared to be decorative hinges for someone's front door. The sight of her bent over her work, completely absorbed in the task at hand, still took his breath away. Over the past few days, they had managed only brief, careful conversations when Jeremiah was present, both of them acutely aware that their every interaction was being watched and judged by the town. "Working late again," he observed, dismounting and tying his horse to the post outside. She looked up with the smile that had become as necessary to him as breathing. "Someone has to finish Mrs. Carver's hinges before her husband decides to hang the door without them." She set down her tools and wiped her hands on her apron. "Besides, I was hoping a certain tall cowboy might stop by." "Were you now?" He pulled the wrapped bundle from his saddlebags, suddenly nervous about his gift in a way that surprised him. "I brought you something." Cordelia's eyes widened as he placed the package in her hands. She unwrapped it with careful attention, her expression shifting from curiosity to wonder as the iron rose was revealed. For a long moment, she simply stared at it, turning it slowly in her palms to examine every detail. "Amos," she whispered, "did you make this?" He nodded, feeling heat rise in his cheeks. "I know it's not much. My metalwork isn't anywhere near as fine as yours, but I thought, well, I wanted you to have something that wouldn't die." "It's beautiful." She traced one of the petals with her fingertip, her touch reverent. "It's the most beautiful thing anyone has ever made for me." "Really?" Instead of answering with words, she stood on her toes and kissed him again, this time without an audience to witness or judge. The kiss was different from their first, deeper, more certain, flavored with the growing confidence that came from choosing each other despite the world's opinions. When they broke apart, Amos rested his forehead against hers, marveling at how perfectly she fit against him despite the differences in their height. "Cordelia, I need you to know something. What people are saying about us, it doesn't matter to me. What matters is how I feel when I'm with you. How do you feel?" "Like I'm finally the man I was meant to be." She smiled at that, an expression so radiant it seemed to light up the entire shop. "You want to know a secret? I've been writing about you, in my journal, things I never thought I'd have the chance to write about any man." "What kind of things?" "The way you listen when I talk about my work, like it actually matters to you. The way you're gentle with the horses, even when you're frustrated with them. The way you see me, really see me, instead of looking through me like I'm invisible." They talked then, sitting on upturned crates near the forge, sharing the kind of conversation that had been impossible under the watchful eyes of the town. Amos told her about his childhood, raised by a succession of ranch hands after his parents died, never quite belonging anywhere until he'd learned to make peace with solitude. Cordelia spoke of her mother's death, how she'd thrown herself into learning the blacksmith trade, partly to honor her father's work and partly to prove she was worth something beyond the town's pity. "Sometimes I dream about expanding the shop," she confided, her voice carrying the wistful quality of long-held hopes. Not just practical work, but beautiful things, decorative pieces that would bring some elegance to this rough country. "Why don't you? Who would buy them? This town doesn't have much use for beauty when survival takes all their attention. Other towns might, bigger places where people have the luxury of wanting things that are beautiful as well as useful." The idea seemed to energize her, and Amos found himself drawn into planning a future that included both of them. Her artistic ambitions, his knowledge of the wider territory, from years of driving cattle to distant markets. They talked about places they'd never seen, dreams they'd never dared speak aloud, possibilities that seemed almost within reach when they were together. It was nearly midnight when Jeremiah returned from his evening at the saloon, finding them still deep in conversation by the dying embers of the forge. If he disapproved of his daughter entertaining a gentleman caller so late, he didn't show it. Instead, he simply nodded to Amos and began preparing to close the shop for the night. "I should go," Amos said, though every part of him wanted to stay. "Yes," Cordelia agreed, though she made no move to step away from him. "Tomorrow? Tomorrow." Their goodbye was brief but meaningful, a kiss that promised continuation rather than ending. As Amos rode back to the ranch through the crisp night air, he felt something he'd never experienced before. The complete certainty that he was exactly where he belonged in the world, even if the world wasn't entirely sure it wanted him there. Found. Next few days brought a routine that felt both natural and revolutionary. Amos would finish his ranch work with an efficiency born of anticipation, then ride to town for evening visits that officially involved legitimate business but really centered on the growing intimacy between him and Cordelia. They took walks along the creek that bordered the town, always careful to stay within sight of the main road to avoid giving the gossips more ammunition than necessary. During these walks, they discovered how much they had in common beneath the surface differences that seemed to fascinate the town so much. Both had learned early that they were different, that they didn't fit the molds others expected them to fill. Both had found solace in work that used their hands and their minds together. Both had made peace with loneliness while secretly hoping for something more. "You know what I like most about you?" Cordelia asked one evening as they sat by the creek, watching the sun set behind the mountains. "What's that?" "You never try to make me smaller. Most people, when they talk to me, it's like they're trying to shrink me down to a size they're more comfortable with. But you let me be exactly as big as I am." "You're not big," Amos said, confused. "I'm not small either. Not in any sense of the word, and you don't seem to need me to be." He understood then what she meant, and it struck him that she was the first person who had ever applied the same principle to him. She didn't need him to be smaller, quieter, less imposing. She accepted his size and strength as simply part of who he was, without fear or the need to constantly manage or minimize his presence. "I love you, Cordelia O'Sullivan," he said, the words coming easier each time he spoke them. "I love you too, Amos Fletcher, and I'm not going to let anyone tell me that's wrong." As they walked back toward town, fingers intertwined despite the risk of being seen, both of them felt the strength that came from being truly known by another person. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Two people who had found in each other not just love, but the courage to be completely themselves. The iron rose sat on the windowsill of the blacksmith shop, catching the last rays of sunlight and casting intricate shadows on the walls, a reminder that the most beautiful things often came from the most unexpected places. Mayor Harrison Blackwell checked his gold pocket watch for the third time in 5 minutes, the ornate timepiece catching the lamplight in his office as he waited for the others to arrive. The watch had belonged to his father and his grandfather. Before that, a symbol of the established order that had governed Dry Hollow for 3 generations. Tonight, that order faced its greatest challenge yet. The first to arrive was Constance, his wife, her face set in the determined expression she wore when organizing charity drives or managing church socials. Behind her came Reverend Crenshaw, nervously adjusting his spectacles as he always did when forced to confront unpleasant realities. Clayton Morrison entered last, his boots still carrying dust from the ride to town, his weathered face grave with concern. "Thank you all for coming," the mayor began, settling into his chair with the authority of long practice. "I think we all know why we're here. This Fletcher situation has gone too far," Constance said without preamble. "That spectacle in front of the blacksmith shop was bad enough, but now they're parading their attachment all over town, walking together, holding hands where children can see. It's unseemly." Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Fletcher's a good worker, best I've ever had, in fact. I hate to lose him over something like this." "Something like this?" Constance's voice rose with indignation. "Clayton Morrison, that man is making a mockery of proper courtship. And with the O'Sullivan girl, of all people. It's not natural." "Now, Constance," the Reverend interjected mildly, "we shouldn't be too harsh in our judgments. The Bible teaches us to love our neighbors. The Bible also teaches us about proper order," she snapped back, "about things being in their right place. That man is a giant, practically a freak of nature, and she's hardly what anyone would call marriageable material. The whole thing is grotesque." Mayor Blackwell raised a hand for silence. Personal feelings aside, we have a practical problem. This situation is creating talk throughout the county. I've had 3 separate conversations with business associates who've heard about our local scandal. It reflects poorly on the town's moral character. What exactly are you proposing we do about it? Morrison asked, though his tone suggested. He already suspected the answer. Economic pressure, the mayor replied. It's the most effective way to handle these situations without creating martyrs. Morrison, you could find reasons to let Fletcher go. Loss of business, changing needs, whatever you prefer. And the O'Sullivans depend on local customers for their livelihood. Morrison frowned. You want me to fire my best ranch hand because you don't approve of who he's courting? I want you to consider what's best for the community as a whole, Blackwell replied smoothly. Fletcher will find work elsewhere. There are always ranches looking for experienced hands. And without his encouragement, the O'Sullivan girl will come to her senses. Her senses? Morrison's voice carried a note of distaste. Seems to me she's showing plenty of sense, choosing a good man who treats her well. Constance leaned forward, her eyes bright with the fervor of someone who believed absolutely in her own righteousness. Clayton, surely you can see how this arrangement threatens the natural order of things. If we allow this kind of mismatch to succeed, what's next? Where do we draw the lines? The rancher was quiet for a long moment, considering. What makes you think they won't just continue their courtship regardless of what we do? From what I've seen, both of them have plenty of backbone. Because, the mayor said, pulling out a folded document, I've been in contact with the territorial authorities about establishing new building codes for businesses that handle fire and dangerous materials. The O'Sullivan shop would need extensive modifications to meet the new requirements. Expensive modifications. Morrison stared at him. You'd use the law to force them apart. I'd use the law to protect this community from unsafe practices, Blackwell replied with the smooth confidence of a politician who had learned to disguise his true motivations. If those modifications happen to be beyond the O'Sullivans' financial means, well, that's simply unfortunate. Reverend Crenshaw cleared his throat nervously. Harrison, I'm not sure this is the Christian approach to the situation. Perhaps if we spoke to them directly, appealed to their better nature. Their better nature. Constance's voice dripped with scorn. Reverend, that woman kissed a man in public view, showing no shame or modesty whatsoever, and he encouraged it. What better nature are you imagining they possess? The meeting continued for another hour, with plans being laid and assignments distributed. Morrison would find reasons to reduce Fletcher's responsibilities and pay, making his position untenable. The Reverend would deliver a sermon about appropriate relationships and God's design for marriage. Constance would organize the church ladies to make their disapproval clear through social pressure. Most importantly, the mayor would begin the process of implementing new regulations that would force the blacksmith shop to either spend money they didn't have or close entirely. As the conspirators dispersed into the night, none of them noticed the small figure pressed against the window outside the mayor's office, or realized that young Timothy Bradshaw had heard every word of their plan. The boy waited until the adults were gone before creeping away from his hiding place, his mind racing with the knowledge of what was about to happen to the 2 people who had shown him nothing but kindness. By morning, the campaign had begun in earnest. Morrison rode out to the Silver Dollar Ranch and called Amos aside for a private conversation that left the big cowboy's jaw tight with controlled anger. The reduction in responsibilities was dressed up as a reorganization of ranch operations, but the message was clear: conform or find yourself looking for work. In town, Cordelia arrived at the blacksmith shop to find a notice posted on her door, an official document bearing the territorial seal and outlining new safety requirements that would cost more than the shop's annual profits to implement. The deadline for compliance was 60 days. Mrs. Patterson, who had been one of their most reliable customers, arrived that afternoon to collect a repaired plough blade and announce that she wouldn't be needing their services anymore. Her husband had decided to take their business to the traveling smith from Cedar Ridge, despite the extra cost and inconvenience. "Nothing personal, dear," she said, though she couldn't meet Cordelia's eyes. "Just think it's for the best, all things considered." 2 more customers cancelled orders before the day was through, leaving Cordelia staring at the official notice and calculating numbers that didn't add up to survival. When Jeremiah returned from his own rounds of suddenly reluctant customers, he found his daughter sitting in the gathering darkness, the iron rose Amos had made her clutched in her hands. "They're not going to let us be happy," she said quietly. "No," her father agreed, settling beside her with a heavy sigh. "Doesn't appear." "They are. What do we do?" Jeremiah was quiet for a long moment, thinking of his late wife and the courage she'd shown in the face of her own battles. "We decide what matters most," he said finally, "and then we fight for it." That evening, when Amos arrived for his usual visit, he found both O'Sullivans waiting for him, with grim determination written across their faces. The campaign to separate him from Cordelia had begun in earnest, but as the 3 of them sat together planning their response, it became clear that the town had made one critical miscalculation. They had assumed that pressure would divide Amos, and Cordelia would make them question whether their love was worth the cost. Instead, it was forging them into something stronger than either had been alone. A partnership ready to stand against whatever forces tried to tear them apart. The battle for their future had been declared, and they intended to win it. The small wooden horse fit perfectly in the palm of Cordelia's hand, its surface smooth from hours of careful whittling. Amos had presented it to her the evening before, carved from a piece of oak during the long hours when sleep eluded him. It was a simple thing, no fancy details or artistic flourishes, but every line spoke of the gentle patience that defined him beneath his intimidating exterior. "You made this while thinking about me?" she asked, turning the tiny figure to catch. "The lamplight. I make everything while thinking about you these days," he admitted, his large hands oddly graceful as he demonstrated how the horse's legs were positioned mid-gallop. "Figured if I'm going to be distracted, might as well have something to show." And for it, they were sitting in the back room of the blacksmith shop, sharing a simple supper of bread and cheese while discussing the day's latest challenges. 3 more customers had cancelled orders, the bank had sent a polite but pointed letter about the shop's mortgage payments, and Reverend Crenshaw had delivered a sermon about unequal yoking that had left no one in doubt about his target. But instead of driving them apart, the mounting pressure seemed to be crystallizing their resolve. Where doubt might have crept in, determination had taken root instead. "I've been thinking," Cordelia said, carefully placing the wooden horse on the table between them. "Maybe we're going about this all wrong." "How do you mean?" "We've been trying to court quietly, keep our business private, not give them anything more to complain about. But they're complaining anyway. They're going to keep complaining no matter what we do." She met his eyes with a steadiness that made his heart race. "So maybe it's time to stop hiding." Amos felt something shift in his chest, a door opening to possibilities he'd been afraid to consider. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting we walk down Main Street together in broad daylight. Hold hands where everyone can see. Let them know we're not ashamed of loving each other, and we're not going to let their disapproval dictate how we live our lives." The idea was both terrifying and exhilarating. For 15 years, Amos had moved through Dry Hollow like a ghost, present but not really participating, accepted but never truly belonging. The thought of claiming his place in the town's social fabric, of standing up and declaring his right to happiness, was foreign enough to make him dizzy. "They'll make things harder for us," he warned. "They're already making things as hard as they can. The only question is whether we face it with dignity or let them drive us into the shadows." Before he could respond, A soft knock at the shop's front door interrupted them. Jeremiah rose to answer it, returning moments later with young Timothy Bradshaw, whose earnest face was flushed with excitement and something that might have been fear. "Evening, Mr. O'Sullivan, Miss Cordelia, Mr. Fletcher," the boy said politely, though his words tumbled together in his haste. "I need to tell you something important about what they're planning." What followed was a detailed account of the mayor's secret meeting, delivered with the breathless urgency of a 12-year-old who understood that he was sharing information that could change everything. Timothy had heard every word through the office window, and his natural sense of justice had compelled him to risk his parents' anger by bringing the news to its intended targets. New building codes. Jeremiah's face darkened as he absorbed the implications. That's not about safety, that's about driving us out of business. And they think if they make me unemployed, I'll leave town and take the problem with me, Amos added grimly. Cordelia was quiet for a long moment, processing everything they'd learned. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a resolve that surprised even her. "Then we'll have to make sure their plan doesn't work." "How do we fight the territorial government?" Jeremiah asked practically. "We don't fight the government. We fight the lie that we're isolated and alone." She stood, beginning to pace the small room with growing energy. "Timothy, who else in town knows about this meeting?" "Just me, far as I know." "They were being real secretive about it." "Good. That gives us an advantage." She turned to face the three men, her eyes bright with the first real hope she'd felt in days. "They're counting on us being too ashamed or too scared to rally support. But what if we're not? What if we tell everyone exactly what's happening and why? You think people will care?" Amos asked, though he could feel himself being drawn into her vision despite his doubts. "I think some people will surprise us. Not everyone in this town is narrow-minded as the mayor's circle. Look at Timothy here. He could have minded his own business, but he didn't." The boy flushed with pride at being included in the adult conversation. "My pa always says you judge a man by his actions, not his appearance. Far as I can see, Mr. Fletcher's actions have been nothing but honorable." It was then that Cordelia made the decision that would change everything. "I want to call a town meeting, not the kind the mayor organizes, where everything's already decided. Beforehand, a real meeting, where people can speak their minds and hear the truth about what's happening." "Cordelia," her father said gently, "that's a big risk. If it goes badly, we'll be no worse off than we are now. But if it goes well, if even a few people stand with us, then maybe we can build something better than what we have." They spent the next hour planning, with Timothy serving as their scout for information about which families might be sympathetic and which were firmly in the opposition camp. The Hendersons, they decided, were too dependent on the mayor's goodwill to risk supporting them openly. But the Carvers had always been independent thinkers, and old Pete Jameson had never met an authority he couldn't question. More importantly, there were the families who had been helped by Cordelia's kindness over the years, people who owed their livelihoods to tools she'd repaired when money was tight, who remembered how she'd refused payment when times were hard, who had witnessed firsthand the gentle strength that defined both her and Amos. As the evening wore on, their plans grew more detailed and their confidence stronger. They would hold the meeting in the open air, on the patch of grass beside the church where the town gathered for festivals and celebrations. They would present the facts clearly and let people decide for themselves whether the campaign against them represented the kind of community they wanted to live in. Most importantly, they would stand together, not as supplicants begging for acceptance, but as members of the community claiming their rightful place in it. When Amos finally rose to leave, he paused at the door and looked back at Cordelia with an expression that made her breath catch. "You know there's no going back after this. Once we make our stand public, we're committed to seeing it through." "I know." She moved to stand beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. "Are you ready for that?" Instead of answering. With words, he leaned down and kissed her, right there in the open doorway where anyone passing by could see. It was a deliberate choice, a declaration that the time for hiding was over. When they broke apart, both of them were smiling with the giddy excitement of people who had decided to stop being afraid. "I guess that answers that question," Jeremiah observed dryly, though his eyes held approval. The next morning, Timothy began spreading word about the town meeting, carefully approaching families who might be sympathetic while avoiding those who would immediately report back to the mayor. By noon, the news was traveling through Dry Hollow's informal networks of gossip and speculation, carried by people who were curious enough about the controversy to want to hear both sides of the story. For the first time since their kiss had set the town buzzing, Amos and Cordelia felt something they'd almost forgotten: hope. They were still facing a battle, but now they would fight it on their own terms, with whatever allies they could gather, and the strength that came from refusing to be ashamed of love. The wooden horse sat on the windowsill beside the iron rose, two simple gifts that represented everything they were fighting for: the right to create beauty together, to build something lasting, to choose love over fear, regardless of what the world thought about their choice. The faded daguerreotype had been tucked between the pages of his father's Bible for 20 years, forgotten until Amos decided to search through the few possessions he'd inherited for anything that might help him understand his own past. The photograph was old-fashioned, taken in the formal style of traveling portrait makers, but the woman it depicted made his breath catch in recognition. She was large, as he remembered his mother being, but the photograph revealed details that childhood memory had obscured: the roundness of her face, the gentle intelligence in her eyes, the way she held herself with quiet dignity despite what must have been constant social pressure. All of it reminded him powerfully of Cordelia. More than that, there was a sadness in his mother's expression that spoke of battles fought and partially lost, of love that had come at great personal cost. On the back, in his father's careful handwriting, were the words, "My beloved Sarah, who taught me that worth has nothing to do with what others think and everything to do with the size of one's heart. May our son learn this lesson with less pain than we did." The discovery hit Amos like a physical blow, recontextualizing everything. He thought he knew about his parents' relationship and his own place in the world. His father hadn't simply loved his mother despite her size. He had loved her because of who she was, and had fought the same battles that Amos and Cordelia were fighting now. The loneliness that had defined his childhood suddenly made sense. His parents had been outsiders in their own community, and their son had inherited that isolation, along with his father's spurs and his mother's gentle heart. He rode to town that afternoon with the photograph carefully tucked in his shirt pocket, arriving at the blacksmith shop to find Cordelia and her father deep in conversation with an unexpected visitor. Mrs. Carver sat uncomfortably on a wooden crate, her weathered hands twisting in her lap as she spoke in hushed, urgent tones. "I'm telling you, it's not just about building codes," she was saying. "My husband heard it straight from Morrison's mouth. The mayor's son has been asking questions about the blacksmith shop, wants to know what it would take to buy the property outright." Cordelia's face went pale. "Henry Blackwell wants to buy our shop. What would he want with it?" "Not for himself," Mrs. Carver explained. "For you. He's been telling anyone who'll listen that you're being led astray by that cowboy, that you need saving from yourself. Says once Fletcher's out of the picture, you'll come to your senses and appreciate the attention of a proper gentleman." The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Henry Blackwell was the mayor's only son, a soft young man of 28 who had never held a real job and lived entirely on his father's influence and money. He was also unmarried, a fact that had become increasingly embarrassing to his parents. As he passed the age when most men had found wives and started families, "He wants to court Cordelia." Jeremiah's voice held a dangerous edge. "That boy couldn't court a fence post successfully." "Oh, it's worse than that," Mrs. Carver continued, glancing around as if afraid of being overheard. He's been telling people that the whole Fletcher situation is just a phase, that you're only entertaining his attention because you think you can't do better. Once he's gone, Henry figures he can step in as the respectable alternative. Amos felt anger building in his chest, the kind of slow-burning rage that came from understanding how thoroughly they'd been manipulated. So the economic pressure, the building codes, getting me fired, it's all about clearing the field for the mayor's son. That's how I see it. And from what I hear, young Henry's been promised that the building code problems will disappear once you two are properly matched. The revelation cast everything in a new light. What had seemed like moral disapproval from the town's leadership was actually a calculated campaign to force Cordelia into an arrangement that would benefit the Blackwell family's social standing while eliminating what they saw as an embarrassing obstacle to their plans. After Mrs. Carver left, promising to spread word about the town meeting to other families who might be sympathetic, Amos pulled out the daguerreotype and shared his own discovery. Cordelia studied the photograph with growing wonder, tracing the lines of his mother's face with gentle fingers. "She was beautiful," Cordelia said softly, "and she looked so sad. My father wrote on the back that they faced the same kind of battles we're fighting. I think that's why I never really belonged here, because they never did either." Jeremiah examined the photograph with the careful attention of someone who remembered those earlier times. "I knew your parents, Amos, not well, but I remember them. Your father was a good man, but they kept to themselves mostly. Now I'm beginning to understand why. They were outcasts too, in their own way. Your mother came from back east, met your father when he was working cattle drives through Kansas. When he brought her here as his bride, well, let's just say the town ladies weren't welcoming. They thought she was too different, too independent. And when you were born and started growing the way you did, it only made things harder for them. The pieces were falling into place, creating a picture that was both heartbreaking and somehow comforting. Amos wasn't the first person in his family to love someone the world deemed unsuitable. His parents had walked this path before him, had fought these same battles, and emerged with their love intact despite the cost. "There's something else you need to know," Jeremiah continued, his voice heavy with old memories. "Your mother didn't. It died from fever, like they told you. She died from heartbreak, from being worn down by years of trying to fit into a place that never wanted her. Your father never forgave himself for not protecting her better." The truth hit Amos like a physical blow, reframing his entire understanding of his childhood and his parents' relationship. His mother had been killed by the same forces that were now trying to destroy his own happiness, ground down by the relentless pressure of social disapproval until her spirit simply broke. "I won't let that happen to us," he said, his voice carrying a determination that surprised even him. "I won't let them do to you what they did to her." Cordelia moved to stand beside him, her hand finding his with the natural ease of long practice. "They won't. We're stronger than they are, Amos. And we're not fighting alone this time." That evening brought another revelation, this one delivered by Timothy Bradshaw, with the breathless excitement of a boy who had stumbled onto adult secrets. He'd been eavesdropping again, this time on a conversation between Henry Blackwell and his father about the timeline for their campaign. "They're not planning to wait for the building codes to work," Timothy reported. "Young Henry wants to make his move at the town meeting. He's going to stand up in front of everyone and declare his intentions to court Miss Cordelia, make it all official and proper-like." "In front of everyone?" Cordelia's voice was tight with controlled anger. His P thinks it'll force your hand, make you choose between public embarrassment and accepting a respectable proposal. They figure you won't want to be seen rejecting the mayor's son in front of the whole town. Amos felt his hands clench into fists, his body responding to the threat before his mind could catch up. The idea of Henry Blackwell putting Cordelia in such a position, of using social pressure to force her into a corner, awakened something protective and dangerous in him. "They're going to turn our town meeting into a trap," Jeremiah observed grimly. "No," Cordelia said, her voice carrying the same determination that had driven her to kiss Amos in front of the entire town. "They're going to turn it into their worst nightmare." She moved to the window, staring out at the darkened streets of Dry Hollow with an expression that would have worried anyone who knew her well. When she turned back to face them, her eyes held a resolve that bordered on fierce. Let Henry Blackwell make his grand gesture. Let him stand up in front of everyone and show them exactly what kind of man thinks he can purchase a woman's affections by destroying her livelihood and driving away the man she loves. She looked directly at Amos, her voice steady and sure. "Because when he does, I'm going to stand up right beside you and tell this town exactly what I think of their proper young gentleman and his respectable proposal." The photograph of Amos's mother seemed to watch from the table where it lay, a reminder that some battles had to be fought regardless of the cost, and that love, real love, was worth fighting for even when the odds seemed impossible to overcome. The town meeting was still 3 days away, but already it was shaping up to be something very different from what either side had originally planned. The simple wedding rings lay side by side on the scarred wooden counter of Henderson's general store, their plain gold surfaces catching the lamplight like promises made tangible. They were nothing fancy. Practical bands that would weather hard, working hard at times. But to Amos and Cordelia, they represented something more valuable than all the elaborate jewelry in the territorial capital. "You're sure about this?" Mr. Henderson asked for the 3rd time, his weathered fingers hovering over the small velvet box. "I mean, with everything that's happening, the talk, the town meeting coming up, maybe you folks might want to wait until things settle down some." "Things aren't going to settle down," Cordelia replied, her voice carrying the calm certainty that had surprised everyone, including herself, over the past few days. "They're going to get worse before they get better. But we're not going to let other people's opinions dictate when we commit our lives to each other." Amos nodded, pulling out the carefully counted coins that represented a significant portion of his savings. "We'd like to marry this Sunday after the town meeting, assuming Reverend Crenshaw will perform the ceremony." Henderson's eyebrows rose toward his hairline. "Sunday? That's mighty quick, son." "Not quick enough, actually," Amos said, glancing at Cordelia with an expression that made her cheeks warm. "I'd marry her today if we could manage it." The shopkeeper wrapped the rings in soft cloth, with the careful attention of someone who understood he was handling more than mere merchandise. "Well, I wish you both all the happiness in the world, and for what it's worth, I think you're doing the right thing. Love's hard enough to find without letting other folks' opinions scare you away from it." As they left the store, rings safely tucked in Amos's shirt pocket, Cordelia felt a lightness she hadn't experienced in weeks. The decision to marry, made in the quiet hours after learning about Henry Blackwell's planned proposal, had settled something fundamental in her soul. Whatever happened at the town meeting, whatever pressure the community brought to bear, she would face it as Amos Fletcher's wife-to-be, with all the strength that commitment brought. The past 3 days had been a whirlwind of preparation, both practical and emotional. Word of the town meeting had spread throughout Dry Hollow and the surrounding ranches, carried by people who were curious about the controversy and eager to witness what promised to be the most dramatic confrontation in recent memory. Some came out of genuine interest in the issues being discussed. Others simply wanted to be present for whatever spectacle might unfold. Timothy Bradshaw had proved invaluable as a scout, using his ability to move unnoticed through adult conversations, to gather intelligence about which families planned to attend and where their sympathies lay. The picture he painted was mixed, but encouraging. While the town's established leadership remained firmly opposed to the relationship, a surprising number of ordinary citizens had begun questioning whether the campaign against Amos and Cordelia represented the kind of community values they wanted to support. "Mrs. Patterson's been talking to her sister over in Cedar Ridge," Timothy reported during one of his evening briefings. "Turns out they had a similar situation there a few years back a well-to-do rancher's daughter who wanted to marry their blacksmith. The family tried to break it up, but the town sided with the couple. Now they're one of the most respected families in the county. And what happened to the families who opposed them? Jeremiah asked practically. They had to learn to live with being wrong in public, Timothy said with the brutal honesty that only children could deliver. Turns out people don't much like folks who try to destroy other people's happiness for no good reason. The evening before the meeting, Amos and Cordelia walked together through the quiet streets of Dry Hollow, their fingers intertwined despite the curious glances from people preparing for bed. The town looked different in the lamplight, softer somehow, more forgiving. It was possible to imagine that this place could become a true home, given time and the willingness of its citizens to grow beyond their prejudices. "Are you nervous?" Cordelia asked, as they paused beside the creek that marked the edge of the settled area. "Terrified," Amos admitted. "I've never been good with public speaking. And tomorrow, I'm going to have to stand in front of the whole town and explain why. I think I'm worthy of you. You don't have to explain anything. You just have to be yourself. The man who carved me a wooden horse because he was thinking about me, who listens when I talk about my dreams, who sees me as someone worth loving instead of someone to be pitied." They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching the moonlight dance on the water and thinking about the path that had brought them to this moment. Both of them had spent years believing they were too different, too outside the norm to ever find the kind of love they witnessed in other couples. Now, on the eve of what might be their most difficult challenge, they had each other. "There's something I want you to know," Amos said finally. "Whatever happens tomorrow, whatever people say or do, I'm proud to love you. I'm proud to be the man you chose, and I'm not going to let anyone make me feel ashamed of that. Even if it costs us everything, even then. My parents lived their whole marriage feeling like they had to apologize for loving each other. I won't do that to us." When they returned to the blacksmith shop, they found Jeremiah waiting with news that would shape the final preparations for the meeting. Reverend Crenshaw had paid a visit, officially declining to perform their wedding ceremony, but unofficially expressing doubts about the campaign being waged against them. "He said he'd been thinking about that sermon he preached," Jeremiah reported, "about unequal yoking and God's design for marriage. Seems his conscience has been troubling him about it." "Troubling him how?" Cordelia asked. "He said when he looks at you two together, he sees more evidence of God's blessing than in half the marriages he's performed over the years. Said maybe he's been confusing social conventions with divine will." The admission was significant, representing a crack in the united front that the town's leadership had tried to maintain. If the Reverend was questioning his position, others might be as well. "Does this mean he'll marry us?" Amos asked hopefully. "Not publicly, not yet, but he suggested that Judge Morrison from the county seat might be willing to perform the ceremony. He's not beholden to local politics the way folks in town are." Plans were quickly revised. Judge Morrison, who rode circuit through the territory performing marriages and settling legal disputes, was known for his practical approach to such matters. A message was sent requesting his presence in Dry Hollow on Sunday, along with a brief explanation of the circumstances. As Saturday dawned clear and cold, the day of the town meeting arrived with an atmosphere of barely contained tension. People began arriving early, claiming seats on the makeshift benches that had been arranged on the grass beside the church. The Hendersons brought their whole family, including elderly grandmother, who rarely ventured out for anything less than a funeral. The Carvers arrived with several neighbors from the outlying ranches, men and women who had driven for hours to witness what everyone expected to be a dramatic confrontation. By afternoon, it was clear that the meeting would be larger than anyone had anticipated. People had come from as far as Cedar Ridge and Miller's Crossing, drawn by stories of the unusual romance and the battle it had sparked. Some came as supporters, others as curious observers, and a few as active opponents determined to see the relationship crushed once and for all. Mayor Blackwell surveyed the growing crowd with visible unease. His carefully orchestrated campaign had assumed a small, manageable audience of local citizens who could be swayed by established authority. Instead, he was facing a diverse group that included people he didn't know, couldn't influence, and might not share his views about appropriate social arrangements. "Perhaps we should postpone," Constance suggested nervously as she observed the crowd gathering outside their window. "This many people. It could get out of hand. We can't postpone now," her husband replied grimly. "Too many people are expecting answers. We'll just have to trust that right is on our side." Henry Blackwell, meanwhile, was experiencing his own moment of doubt. The grand gesture he'd planned, the public proposal that would force Cordelia to choose between him and social disgrace, seemed less brilliant when faced with the reality of making it in front of hundreds of strangers. But his father's expectations, combined with his own wounded pride at being rejected in favor of a common ranch hand, drove him forward. As the sun began its descent toward the mountains, Amos stood in the small mirror of his cabin, attempting to make himself presentable for what might be the most important evening of his life. His best shirt was clean and pressed, his hair combed as neatly as its stubborn waves would allow, his father's spurs polished to their original silver shine. In his pocket, the wedding rings rested beside the faded daguerreotype of his parents, reminders of love's power to endure despite all obstacles. Across town, Cordelia was making her own preparations, choosing her words carefully and steeling herself for whatever the evening might bring. She had braided her mother's locket into her hair, a subtle reminder of the strength and courage that had been passed down through generations of women who had loved despite the world's disapproval. The stage was set, the players in position, and the town of Dry Hollow was about to discover what happened when love refused to hide in the shadows any longer. Sunday morning dawned with the crystalline clarity that only came with the first hard frost of winter, the air so sharp and clean it seemed to ring like a bell with each breath. Cordelia stood before the small mirror in her bedroom, adjusting the simple white dress she had sewn herself during the long evenings when sleep proved elusive. The fabric was nothing special, cotton purchased from Henderson's store, but she had crafted it with the same careful attention to detail that she brought to her metalwork, every seam straight, every button secure. The dress represented more than mere clothing. It was her declaration of independence from the expectations that had shaped her entire life. No one had chosen the style for her, no committee of town ladies had approved the design. It was hers alone, created by her own hands for her own wedding day, regardless of what anyone else thought about the man she had chosen to marry. Judge Morrison had arrived as promised, a lean man in his 60s with kind eyes and the weathered look of someone who had spent decades traveling rough country to bring law and order to frontier communities. He had listened to their story without judgment, asked practical questions about their intentions and their ability to support each other, and pronounced himself satisfied with their answers. "I've married couples who had every advantage of birth and fortune," he'd told them the evening before, "and I've buried some of those same couples after they destroyed each other with their incompatible dreams. Love is rare enough in this world without letting other folks' opinions interfere with it." Now, as Cordelia made her final preparations, she could hear the sounds of activity in the street outside, horses arriving, voices raised in greeting, the general bustle that accompanied any significant gathering in Dry Hollow. The town meeting had been postponed at the judge's suggestion, replaced by something far more direct, a wedding that would settle the matter once and for all. "Either they'll accept you as members of this community," Judge Morrison had explained, "or they'll reveal themselves for the small-minded busybodies they are. Either way, you'll know where you stand." Downstairs, Jeremiah was receiving the steady stream of well-wishers who had begun arriving before dawn. Mrs. Carver had brought a cake baked in her own kitchen, declaring that every wedding deserved proper refreshments regardless of the controversy surrounding it. Old Pete Jameson had surprised everyone by producing a violin and offering to provide music for the ceremony, his arthritis-gnarled fingers still capable of coaxing sweet melodies from the strings. Timothy Bradshaw served as an unofficial scout, darting between the growing crowd of supporters and the equally determined group of opponents who had gathered near the church. His reports painted a picture of a community divided but not conquered, with more people willing to stand with Amos and Cordelia than anyone had dared hope. "The Hendersons are here, and they brought their cousins from Miller's Crossing," he reported, breathlessly. "Mrs. Patterson's here too, but she's standing with the mayor's bunch, and there's more folks I don't recognize. Must have come from pretty far out to be here this early." As the morning progressed, it became clear that the simple wedding Amos and Cordelia had envisioned was becoming something larger and more significant. People were choosing sides not just about their relationship, but about what kind of community Dry Hollow would be going forward. Would it remain a place where established families dictated social arrangements, or would it become somewhere that judged people by their character rather than their conformity to arbitrary standards? At 10:00, Amos emerged from his cabin wearing his best clothes and carrying himself with a dignity that impressed even his critics. The walk from the Silver Dollar Ranch to the town center took 20 minutes, during which he was joined by an increasing number of supporters, ranch hands who respected his work ethic, townspeople who had witnessed his unfailing courtesy, families who had benefited from his quiet acts of kindness over the years. By the time he reached the grassy area beside the church where the ceremony would take place, he was leading what could only be described as a procession. The sight seemed to unnerve Mayor Blackwell and his allies, who had apparently expected Amos to arrive alone and ashamed, easy to intimidate or drive away. Instead, he took his place beside Judge Morrison with the calm assurance of a man who knew exactly what he was doing and why. When Cordelia appeared in the doorway of the blacksmith shop, radiant in her handmade dress and carrying herself with the confidence of a woman who had chosen her own path, the murmur of approval from the crowd was audible even to those who opposed. The union. The procession from shop to ceremony site was brief but meaningful, with Jeremiah walking proudly beside his daughter while friends and supporters lined the route. But it was also the moment when the opposition chose to make their stand. Henry Blackwell stepped forward just as Cordelia reached the improvised altar, his face flushed with a combination of embarrassment and determination. "Wait," he called, out loud enough for the entire gathering to hear. "Before this proceeds any further, there's something that needs to be said." The moment Henry Blackwell stepped forward, a tense silence fell over the gathered crowd, as if everyone present understood they were witnessing something that would be remembered and discussed for years to come. Henry's face was flushed with nervous determination, his hands shaking slightly as he addressed not just Cordelia, but the entire assembly. "Miss O'Sullivan," he began, his voice carrying farther than he'd intended, "I cannot stand by and watch you make what I believe to be a terrible mistake. You deserve better than this arrangement. You deserve a man who can provide for you properly, who can offer you the social position and security that you've been denied." A murmur rippled through the crowd, some voices expressing approval, while others carried clear disapproval of the interruption. But Henry pressed on, emboldened by what he mistook for support. "I am prepared to offer you marriage," he declared, pulling a small velvet box from his coat pocket. "Real marriage, to a man of standing in this community. You would want for nothing, have a proper home, be received in the best society. All you have to do is step away from this spectacle, and accept what any reasonable woman would recognize as a far superior proposal." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the distant sound of wind through the bare branches of the cottonwoods. Henry stood with his proposal hanging in the air, apparently confident that the public nature of his offer would force Cordelia to accept out of social obligation, if nothing else. But he had fundamentally misunderstood the woman he was addressing. Cordelia looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she stepped closer to Amos, taking his hand with a gesture that was both natural and deliberate. When she finally spoke, her voice carried clearly to every person present. "Mr. Blackwell," she said, "I appreciate the honor of your proposal, but I'm afraid you've misunderstood something fundamental about this situation. I'm not settling for Amos Fletcher because I think I can't do better. I'm choosing him because he is better. Better than any man who would try to purchase a woman's affections by destroying her livelihood and driving away the person she loves." Henry's face went from flushed to pale in an instant. "I don't know what you mean, don't you?" Cordelia's voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath the silk. "Shall I tell everyone about the building codes that appeared so conveniently? About the customers who were suddenly told to take their business elsewhere? About the plan to force Amos from his job so that you could step forward as the respectable alternative?" The crowd was shifting now, people turning to look at Mayor Blackwell and his allies, with expressions ranging from surprise to disgust. Mrs. Carver spoke up from the middle of the gathering, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had lived through enough small-town politics to recognize manipulation when she saw it. "Is that true, Harrison? Did your family orchestrate this whole campaign just to clear the field for your boy?" Before the mayor could respond, Jeremiah O'Sullivan stepped forward, his blacksmith's hammer held not as a weapon, but as a symbol of honest work and the dignity it brought. His weathered face was set with quiet anger, the kind that came from watching his daughter's happiness be treated as a commodity to be bartered and sold. "I've listened to enough," he said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had earned respect through decades of service to his community. "My daughter has chosen a good man, a man who treats her with kindness and respect, who sees her worth without needing to be convinced of it. And in return, the so-called leaders of this town have tried to destroy that happiness for their own selfish purposes." He looked directly at Mayor Blackwell, his gaze unwavering. "You want to talk about what's unseemly? What's unseemly is trying to force a woman into marriage by making her other choices impossible. What's unseemly is using your position to hurt good people who've done nothing wrong except love each other." The crowd was murmuring more loudly now, and the sound was decidedly unsympathetic to the Blackwells. Old Pete Jameson raised his violin and began playing a wedding march, the sweet melody cutting through the tension like a blade through silk. Others took up the tune, humming along, creating a barrier of music that pushed back against the ugliness of the interruption. Judge Morrison, who had been observing the confrontation with the patience of someone accustomed to human folly, finally stepped forward. "I believe I've heard enough to understand the situation," he said, his judicial authority bringing immediate quiet. "Mr. Blackwell, your proposal has been declined with considerably more grace than it deserved. I suggest you accept that decision and allow this ceremony to proceed." Henry looked around desperately, seeking support that was rapidly evaporating. Even his own father appeared embarrassed by the public spectacle, finally understanding that his carefully laid plans had backfired spectacularly. Instead of forcing Cordelia into an unwanted marriage, he had exposed his family's manipulation to the scrutiny of the entire community. "This isn't over," Henry said weakly, though his threat lacked conviction. "Yes, it is," Amos spoke for the first time since the confrontation began, his deep voice carrying absolute finality. "It's over because Cordelia has made her choice, and that choice is final. It's over because this community has seen what you're really offering, and they've found it wanting." He turned to face the crowd, his presence commanding attention without effort. "I know I'm not what you expected for her. I'm too big, too quiet, too different from what you think a husband should be. But I love her with everything I am, and I will spend my life proving worthy of that love. That's not a promise I'm making to you. It's a promise I'm making to her." The response from the crowd was immediate and overwhelming. Applause broke out, scattered at first, but quickly spreading, until nearly everyone present was clapping. Mrs. Henderson wiped tears from her eyes, while several of the ranch hands let out whoops of approval that would have been more appropriate at a cattle drive than a wedding. Henry Blackwell retreated to stand with his parents, his grand gesture having achieved exactly the opposite of what he'd intended. Instead of exposing the relationship as inappropriate, he had revealed his own character and his family's in the harsh light of public scrutiny. Judge Morrison smiled and opened his book. "Well then," he said, "shall we have a wedding?" 6 months after their wedding, Amos and Cordelia Fletcher stood in the doorway of their expanded blacksmith shop, watching the sun rise over Dry Hollow with the satisfaction that came from work well done and love well chosen. The early morning air carried the scent of spring wildflowers and fresh bread from the bakery down the street, along with the familiar sounds of a community beginning another day. The garden tools scattered around their feet told the story of their morning's work, preparing the patch of ground behind the shop for the vegetables Cordelia had planned and the flowers Amos insisted on adding, because beauty matters as much as function. Their hands bore the honest dirt of cultivation, and their faces showed the contentment of people who had found their place in the world despite all the forces that had tried to prevent it. "Mrs. Patterson stopped by yesterday," Cordelia mentioned, adjusting the position of a hand-forged trowel. "Wanted to place an order for decorative hinges for her front door. Said she'd been admiring the ones we made for the carvers." Amos smiled at that, remembering the months when Mrs. Patterson had been among their most vocal critics. The change in attitude hadn't happened overnight, but gradually, as the town had witnessed the quiet happiness of their marriage and the continued excellence of their work. Fear of change, it turned out, was often temporary when confronted with the evidence that change could bring good things. The blacksmith shop had indeed expanded, both physically and in the scope of its services. Word of Cordelia's artistic metalwork had spread to neighboring towns, bringing customers who traveled considerable distances for pieces that combined function with beauty. The additional income had allowed them to hire Timothy Bradshaw as an apprentice, the boy having shown both aptitude for the work and loyalty beyond his years. Timothy emerged from the shop's interior now, his face streaked with soot but glowing, with the pride of someone who had found his calling early. At 13, he was already showing the steady hands and careful eye that marked a natural craftsman, and his enthusiasm for learning had made him an invaluable addition to their small business. "Mr. Fletcher," he called out, "that commission from Cedar Ridge is ready for your inspection. Think you'll be pleased with how the scroll work turned out." The commission he referred to was a set of decorative gates for the town's new courthouse, an order that represented the kind of artistic work Cordelia had once only dreamed of creating. That it had come from a community 30 miles away spoke to the growing reputation they had built together, combining her creativity with his understanding of the broader market. Jeremiah appeared from the house he now shared with them, built onto the back of the shop in a configuration that provided privacy while keeping the family close. The past months had been good to him as well, his pride in his daughter's happiness evident in everything from his improved health to his renewed enthusiasm for his craft. He had taken over much of the routine repair work, freeing Cordelia to focus on the more specialized commissions that brought both artistic satisfaction and financial security. "Judge Morrison's in town again," he reported, settling into his favorite chair with the morning coffee that had become their daily ritual. "Mentioned he's had 3 couples approach him about wedding ceremonies. Seems they were inspired by your example." It was true that their wedding had marked a turning point for Dry Hollow, though the changes had been subtle rather than dramatic. The community hadn't suddenly embraced all forms of difference, but it had begun questioning whether social conformity was as important as they'd previously believed. Young people especially seemed more willing to follow their hearts rather than their parents' expectations. The Blackwell family had weathered their public embarrassment with varying degrees of grace. The mayor had quietly dropped the building code enforcement that had threatened the shop, while Constance had gradually resumed speaking to Cordelia in public, though their interactions remained formal. Henry himself had left town shortly after. The wedding, reportedly taking a position with his uncle's business in Denver, where his prospects for marriage were presumably better. "Any word from Morrison about when he'll be back through?" Amos asked, settling beside his wife on the step. They'd built specifically for morning conversations like this one. "Next month," he said. "Why do you ask?" Amos and Cordelia exchanged a look that made Jeremiah raise his eyebrows with interest. They'd been discussing a particular matter for several weeks now, waiting for the right moment to share their news. "Well," Cordelia said, unable to suppress the smile that had been threatening to break free all morning, "we might have need of his services again. Different kind of celebration this time." It took Jeremiah a moment to understand, and when he did, his coffee cup rattled against the saucer as he set it down with shaking hands. "We mean you're going to be a grandfather," Amos confirmed, his voice carrying the wonder that still struck him every time he considered the prospect. "Come spring, there'll be another Fletcher running around Dry Hollow." The joy that transformed Jeremiah's face was worth all the challenges they'd faced to reach this moment. He rose from his chair and embraced them both, his weathered hands gentle with the knowledge that he was holding not just his daughter and son-in-law, but the future they were building together. "A baby," he whispered, as if saying it too loudly might cause the miracle to disappear. "Margaret would be so proud." As the morning progressed and word of their news began to spread through the informal networks that carried all information, in small towns the response confirmed what they'd already begun to understand. Their place in Dry Hollow was secure, not because they had conquered their opposition, but because they had outlasted it. Love, it seemed, had a persistence that prejudice couldn't match. Old Pete Jameson stopped by to offer his congratulations and share the news that his grandson was courting the Carver girl, despite the significant difference in their heights. Mrs. Henderson brought preserves, and the observation that love comes in all shapes and sizes, and the Lord knows what he's about when he brings two people together. Even Mrs. Patterson made an appearance, her manner still somewhat stiff, but her intentions clearly good. "I owe you both an apology," she said, her words coming with obvious difficulty. "I let fear and gossip guide my actions when I should have. Trusted my own eyes. You've been nothing but good neighbors, and I'm ashamed it took me so long to see it." As evening settled over their small corner of the world, Amos and Cordelia sat together in the garden they'd planted, surrounded by tools they'd made with their own hands and dreams they'd built together despite every obstacle. The iron rose he'd crafted for her still sat on the windowsill, joined now by the wooden horse and a growing collection of small treasures that marked the milestones of their relationship. "Do you ever think about how different things might have been?" Cordelia asked, her hand resting on the subtle curve of her belly where their child grew. "Sometimes," Amos admitted, "but not with regret. Every choice that brought us here was worth making." She leaned against his shoulder, marveling as she always did at how perfectly they fit together, despite all the ways they were supposed to be wrong for each other. "I love you, Amos Fletcher. I love you too, Mrs. Fletcher, and I always will." As the stars emerged overhead and the sounds of Dry Hollow settled into nighttime quiet, two people who had once believed they were too different for love watched over the life they'd built together, secure in the knowledge that some battles once won stayed won, and that the best victories were the ones that made the world a little more welcoming for everyone who came after.